I think I'm convincing myself that consciousness is fundamental, but that's not like I can't tell anyone that. Sounds great.
Right, right.
Sounds crazy even to me. And I mostly work with neuroscientists, and I know this is going to sound pseudoscientific to them.
Welcome to Closer to Truth. I'm speaking with author and consciousness explorer and visionary Annaka Harris about her remarkable new audio documentary series, Lights On, investigating the mysteries of consciousness. Is consciousness a fundamental building block of the universe? Can artificial intelligence ever truly replicate the subjective experience of being conscious? Big questions, favored Closer to Truth questions in Lights On. Welcome, Annaka. Great to meet. Shocking we haven't met before.
Yeah, I was just saying, I thought maybe I had met you at some point. We know many people in common, but
We do,
great
but
to finally meet and have this conversation. Yeah.
our spirits probably melded in the past
Yeah.
in some sense. Anyway,
Yeah.
congratulations on this series. I've gone
Thank you.
through it. It's really terrific. It's a unique contribution to consciousness, which has been a mutual passion of both of ours. I'm really
Yeah.
looking forward to
Yeah.
our discussion. I thought I'd start with sort of a kind of a throwaway question, but
Mm,
it's intriguing. I love the title, Lights On. It's an
mm.
evocative title. And so how did it come about?
Thank you. Yeah, it actually there is a story behind it. It was the original title of my book, Conscious, which we ended
Ah.
up changing when we published that. It's funny. It is because originally, I my take on the hard problem of consciousness was like most scientists today, and actually in the documentary series, you hear scientists such as Brian Greene and Sean Carroll talk about how they view consciousness kind of similarly to the way we viewed life before we understood what life was, and so that they're really the hard problem of consciousness will eventually be solved. That there's some way in which that we don't yet understand, but we will eventually understand how complex processing results in a conscious experience. And when I would argue with people who were on the other side of that, the side I'm now on, I would make the analogy to the lights coming on in a room. That it seems, when you don't understand the science, it seems miraculous to flip a switch and suddenly a dark room is filled with light. But once you understand the physics, once you understand, how that all comes to be, it's still, an incredible reality that we live in, but it's no longer mysterious in that way. You can see how you go from no light to light with the flip of a switch. And so that was my argument for the other side. I now have crossed over, but I love that analogy and the imagery it brings also to what consciousness is and why it's so mysterious, and how there's a sense in which the lights come on from the inside of a system.
Mm.
And I use that analogy a lot.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so it's really two versions of Lights On. One lights on the switch, which has a very simple explanation once you understand it, and then
Right.
the other side of Lights On, that there's this magical thing inside. So it's a very very nice parallel. I love when sophisticated people, scientists, philosophers change
Mm,
their mind. It's really
mm.
rare,
Yes.
really rare.
It's
But
it's
but
it's
that
rare. It's rare in all human beings, I would say. But yes, in the sciences, it is one thing I love about science, which is that when push comes to shove, a scientist who is a true scientist at heart will change their mind
absolutely.
when they're presented with the evidence. And actually, I think enjoy that process. I think
Absolutely.
yeah,
Some people get so invested in their own theories that it becomes, kind of ego related.
yeah,
But a true
right.
scientist will really love to be wrong, because then
Yes,
you learn something. If you're
yes,
always talking and teaching your own theory, you don't learn anything.
that's
Um,
right.
I like
And
to.
you're closer to truth, which is why I love the title of your show.
And that's why we don't have a "the" in it. A lot of people say closer to the
Mm,
truth, and I go crazy when I hear the "the." I said, "No,
mm,
it's no the. It's present
yeah,
progressive. It's a
that's
process. We
right.
don't claim to have the truth, even though a lot
That's
of
right.
people want us to have it. We can't have
Mm,
it."
mm.
I want to go back to your major book, your best-selling book, Conscious:
Okay.
A Brief Guide to the Fundamental Mystery of the Mind, in
Mm,
which you ask the basic questions: What is consciousness? What what gives rise to consciousness? Where does it exist in nature in the phylogenetic scale? Could AI become conscious? I mean, these are the basic questions
Yeah.
that we all ask, and you posed it wonderfully in that book.
Thank you.
What I'm interested in is
Mm.
now that you say in presenting the audio documentary
Mhm.
of many people doing this, which in a sense is a sequel in a different media and different way to present it.
Yeah.
You say that your book, Conscious, presents new questions about the felt experience of consciousness, but the audio
Mm.
documentary, Lights On, seeks, you don't say you do, seeks to find the answers.
Yeah.
So that's pretty ambitious.
Yeah. Yes, luckily I didn't actually know what I was working on when I began to work on this project. I just knew that, I was still fascinated with the topic and that there were so many new questions that came up for me in the process of researching and writing my book
Hmm,
that I just wanted to keep digging,
right.
and sorry, I may have lost sight of your question there. Was there was there a
No,
specific question? Yeah,
that is exactly on point. That
yeah,
you moved. You wanted to continue the process, but
yes,
as a framing, a
mm,
conscious was a way that you um, embodied yourself, immersed yourself in the questions,
right,
whereas now you're more seeking answers, maybe different
yes,
kinds of answers. So
yeah, so
I'm
I
asking,
actually
is that a
yeah, yeah,
differentiation concept? Not that you think, not that you become a new missionary with your view
yeah.
of consciousness, but one is analyzing and appreciating the question. The other is trying to seek an answer.
Yes. And so, the most interesting question to me that came up as a result of my research and writing my book, Conscious, was this question about whether consciousness might go deeper in nature than the sciences have previously assumed. And through the process of writing that book, I became more and more convinced that there is a very good chance it does run deeper, and possibly all the way to the fundamental level. And so I had a whole new category of questions,
Mm,
that I was interested in exploring, and so this is where seeks to find the answers, and it's really the answers to these questions. Is it even possible? Is it physically possible that consciousness, goes down to the fundamental level or goes down to, beyond simple systems like insects and worms? Is it possible that inanimate objects contain some level of consciousness? Is that a serious scientific question to ask? Because we get into the fundamental realm, is this something that physicists are thinking about, are interested in, think is a possibility? And then I just got deeper and deeper through. The reason it's an audio documentary and not an audio book is because it really follows my quest from the very first questions I had
mm,
after finishing my book, to, I put together this list of scientists that I wished I could talk to, or who I knew and knew I wanted to reach out to. And so it really kind of took on a life of its own, where each conversation led me to the next conversation
mm,
or led me to write a paper to clarify my thinking. And so the documentary really follows about a 4-year path I took
mm,
of investigating, asking these questions, and yeah, seeking to find, not concrete answers to the ultimate question, but answers to whether it makes sense to follow this line of inquiry, answers to whether it's possible to take a new path in science where rather than assuming consciousness arises out of very complex systems, which is the assumption we've been going with all this time. What if we assume, since in either case, and I can make a stronger argument for this, but in either case, we're really making an assumption. It turns out we don't truly have evidence for assuming that consciousness arises out of complexity. And so, what if we began with the other assumption that consciousness is fundamental and it's a much simpler um, feature of the universe, and what would that science look like? And are there any scientists interested in exploring this question? And could we ever design experiments to get verification? And so there are all these questions that ultimately do not yet have answers, but I got much closer.
Well,
So I got much closer to
closer is very much
understanding.
resonant with our way of thinking.
Yes.
So we are
And
compadres
I
on that.
yeah.
Can you point to a specific event or
Mm,
conversation in doing your book, Conscious,
yeah.
when you began to see that transition point,
Mm,
when you sensed in yourself a serious consideration of
mm.
what would seem to most scientists to be a very bizarre concept?
Yeah, that's a great question, and there wasn't really a single moment, and it's funny, it was actually my own writing, my own philosophizing, where I continued to convince myself. I think I say in my conversation with Brian Greene in the documentary, I was playing devil's advocate and the devil started winning the argument. And so it just logically and intellectually, the more I thought about it, the more I wrote about it, the more I convinced myself that it actually, in many ways, makes more sense to assume consciousness is fundamental than to assume it emerges out of complexity.
And that occurred.
And that still, by the way, sounds completely insane to me coming out of my mouth. I mean, I really have to wrestle with my intuitions in order to be able to think that way. And that's a lot of what this documentary is kind of forcing myself into a new paradigm, forcing myself
Mm.
to imagine the world is structured very differently from the way I've always assumed it's structured. And to see if I can kind of find new intuitions for that, find new answers about certain phenomena that we witness in the world. You know, how would we interpret that phenomena if consciousness is fundamental rather than emergent.
Mm.
And so I spend a lot of time exploring, but this exploration began in the writing of my book. And so I make this argument based on the neuroscience and based on my many years of working with neuroscientists that everything we have learned about the brain actually are arguments against consciousness emerging at the level of the brain, and we can get into those details
Mm.
if you want to.
Yeah,
But
we
so
surely will.
yeah, I mean, I really just um, what's the word? As I kind of systematically went through all of the ways we might explain consciousness emerging in the universe, it seemed more and more logical and more scientific, frankly, to assume that consciousness is fundamental and does not emerge at some higher level.
And that realization, gradual, occurred in your writing, in your synthesis of the work, as opposed to any specific conversation that you might have had.
That's right. I mean, I think it was the totality of it, but
Okay.
ultimately it was in my own writing where I just found myself, and I remember talking to colleagues and my husband Sam, who's a neuroscientist and also writes about consciousness. I remember saying, I think I'm convincing myself that consciousness is fundamental, but that's not like I can't tell anyone that. Sounds great.
Right, right.
Sounds crazy even to me. And I mostly work with neuroscientists, and I know this is going to sound pseudoscientific to them. And so part of the reason I wrote my book and also the reason I created this documentary is to lay out the case step by step so that um, others can kind of join me or not actually. It was a way for me to kind of test my own philosophizing about it. I said to a couple of the physicists in the documentary that, you know, I would love for someone to explain to me where I've made a mistake in my argumentation. I mean, this sounds crazy. I don't need to spend the rest of my life going down this path if it's not true. I'd really, you know, I'd like to know. And so part of my project and my path in this documentary was really seeking to get a great argument against the argument I was making. You know, I really was wanting to understand whether my argumentation made sense, and whether I could convince others or whether they could convince me to drop to drop this line of questioning.
The
So
best way to test your own theory is to present the alternative as rigorously and as toughly and as
that's
a
right.
highest quality level that you can. I try to
Yes,
do that as well, and put yourself
right.
into it as though you really believe the opposite of what you really believe.
Yes. And
Uh,
it's what I so admire about the scientists I work with and the scientific process in general. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
very, very much so. The philosopher Jerry Fodor, one of my favorite, died tragically young, put it this way: consciousness is among the most the ultimate metaphysical mysteries. And then he added, he says, don't bet on anybody ever solving it. Um,
Yeah,
and,
right,
and part of that was because he was in the neuroscience, very much the physicalist, the world, when
right.
he said, I think he said that in, in the early 90s or something.
Mm,
And obviously we've come a long way, both with neuroscience knowledge and with philosophical analysis. And one of my favorite ideas that I've used
mm,
is that neuroscience, since I did my a degree at the Brain Research Institute at UCLA, I got my
mhm.
doctorate in 1968. So I think Sam was there like 40 years later or so,
Yeah.
shows our age really. But at that time, I was very immersed in it,
Yeah,
and but I had these feelings that had to be kept quiet during those
yeah,
periods. But Jerry
yeah,
Fodor was the one who sort of expressed during that era when it was none of this conversation you could have.
yeah.
He
Things
was the
things
one
have
who.
changed a lot in the last few years, though. I felt that way when before I wrote my book, anyone I was thinking about writing an article, and everyone I spoke to said, "This will ruin your career. Don't even mention this at dinner parties. Like, keep
Right,
this to
right.
yourself." So there's been a big shift in the last 5 or so years.
Yeah, and
Um,
I love talking to some neuroscientists. I'm not going to mention names, but you'd know
yeah,
them. When I say, "Well, how do you account for that?" and then they're just baffled, and
yeah, yeah,
it's like they have no words to describe that, and
yeah,
so I think
yeah, yeah,
that's fun. So a highlight in the documentary series is your very serious consideration of it in a very logical and thoughtful way. Is consciousness fundamental?
yeah,
And that could be an irreducible property of the universe.
yeah.
So I want to ask you this question, which I've
Mm,
thought about.
mm,
You pose this as, and I think that's a quote, perhaps an even more scientific question: is consciousness fundamental?
mm,
So my question is,
yeah,
if consciousness is irreducible,
yeah,
let's make that assumption. It is. Why would it be a scientific question? Because
mm,
irreducible would mean it's
mm,
not reducible to physics,
mm,
not reducible to electromagnetism,
yeah,
gravity, weak force, strong force,
yeah,
string theory, nothing.
yeah,
It's not irreducible is the word. So
yeah.
if it's irreducible, how can it be a scientific question?
Yeah, well, I mean, I can answer that in a couple of ways. I think, physics is the science of the fundamental, and if we're wrong in assuming that all of the physics and the math and everything that we understand so far about space-time and quantum mechanics and all the rest, um, if it's true that what that is describing at bottom is felt experience, is consciousness, rather than describing non-conscious processes. That is a paradigm shift that I think will ultimately affect the science we do moving forward. That's one side of it. The other side of it, I think it truly changes the way we think about what these theories are telling us. That's the second part. And the third part is we don't yet understand what quantum mechanics is telling us really about the nature of reality. And if it's in fact correct that consciousness is fundamental, and this takes 11 hours of my documentary, and I'm publishing a paper soon, kind of making this argument. Um, the assuming that consciousness is fundamental actually helps us make sense of some paradoxes that arise out of quantum mechanics. I don't think that's a reason to believe that it's fundamental, but if you take this other path that I've taken through neuroscience, and arrive at the conclusion that it actually makes sense um, to assume consciousness is fundamental and run all of our science with that assumption. One interesting conclusion that I discovered through the course of working on this documentary is that it actually helps us make sense of some of the things quantum mechanics says about the way the universe works.
A-
Um,
And of course, the argument against that from many of our mutual friends is that you take two mysteries, you try to combine them together and try to
Yes, which
solve
is
it.
why
And
I'm very
that
clear
doesn't work.
about that's not a reason to believe it. That
Mhm.
it's not because quantum because they're both mysterious. I would never take the path through the physics to conclude that consciousness is fundamental. The path I took, and I was surprised at where I landed, the path I took was through neuroscience, through looking at what consciousness is, what the brain is telling us about how conscious experiences correlate with brain activity, and then whether it actually makes sense from that level to talk about consciousness emerging, or being something that's more fundamental to the structure itself. I came to the conclusion purely from that angle, from the neurosciences, that it actually makes more sense that consciousness is a property that already existed, that does not arise out of brain processing. And so
So
once
that's
you
really
reach
important.
that, yeah, and so very important, because I don't believe that there's any way to get to that conclusion through the physics. What's interesting to me is that once you accept that that's a legitimate scientific assumption to make, and I call it an assumption. We don't know. We don't know if consciousness arises out of complex processing. We don't know if it's fundamental. We are still at a place where there's very little we understand about consciousness. It's a mystery. But if we move forward with an assumption that it's fundamental, this actually does, and this was a total surprise to me, this actually does help us make sense of some of the things that are coming out of quantum mechanics. And so that's just a further data point for me. It's also just interesting that there's, in the same way that, Albert Einstein started thinking about space and time as part of the same structure, and this is a paradigm shift and a new framework for how we think about reality. Once he could get his mind around that intuition, or wherever that intuition came from for him, suddenly you're looking at gravity in a very different way. You see, oh, it's not a force that is intrinsic to the universe. It's a slightly different picture than the one we had, where space-time is being warped and causes objects to behave in this way because of kind of this material that they're embedded in. Material is not quite the right word, but you get the idea. And so um, I think this is a useful shift for our framework when we're doing fundamental science, to say, if it's legitimate to assume consciousness is fundamental, even though we don't know, there's a different starting place. Maybe we can start to change the way we. It's almost as if we can look at phenomena we see in the universe with a new assumption. And does that help us understand these phenomena better? And I think in some cases it does, and that's fascinating to me, and completely unexpected. So,
So
yeah.
this is a really this is a really important distinction in the
Mm,
nature of how we're using the word, that it's a scientific question. It's not
mm,
so much science will be used to experiments to falsify alternatives and therefore conclude that consciousness fundamental is the right theory. It's in other words, in a proactive proof
yeah.
through falsification or whatever else.
Although
That's the
actually,
science.
yeah,
That's that's a
I wouldn't
scientific
say,
method. The alternative that I think you're saying is that
yeah,
if you make the assumption,
yeah,
then there are scientific implications that
exactly.
would maybe help understand better, which would be consistent with
Yes,
the theory, as opposed to
yes.
proving it in a scientific method.
Yes, although there's an addition to that, and it wouldn't be proving, but one thing that I talk about in the final chapters of my documentary is something that I am calling experiential science. And I have no idea, all the directions this might lead, but just the concept um, gives me a sense that I don't think we can ever prove it one way or the other. And there are a lot of reasons that consciousness is unique, and it's very unlikely that we can prove it one way or the other. But either way, we're making an assumption. And I think there are many scientific experiments that could be done that would make us much more confident that it's many times more likely that consciousness is fundamental than emergent. And so a few, I don't know if you want to get into this now. This is kind of the
Maybe when
conclusion of my documentary, but I think there are a lot of interesting ways. And part of what I like about this paradigm shift is, like any other scientific paradigm shift, it breaks open our curiosity in a way that if we're thinking about the universe in this different way, suddenly there are all these ideas for new experiments, and I can share some of the ones I've had with you already. But yes,
What's an
we're then
example? What's an
yeah.
example?
Um, so there are a few different areas this can go into. One is actually an area of neuroscience that is already underway. And I talked to David Eagleman, the neuroscientist, about this in my documentary. So he's working on something called sensory addition. He started with sensory substitution, but he's also now working on sensory addition. Sensory substitution is for people who've lost the ability to use one of their senses, someone who's blind, someone who's deaf. There are these tools that they've developed where they convert either video signal or sound signal to electrotactile signals that the patient can feel. And eventually we've learned that because of the plasticity of the brain can start to interpret those signals so well that it is practically like the person is seeing again. They're using a different way to perceive the same signal, and their brain is able to give them a map in the same way that our eyes give us a map of the external world. So
Hmm.
people who use something called a brain port, which is an example of this um, sensory substitution, um, eventually when they're trained on it, they can shoot hoops, they can walk through mazes. These are people who are blind, born blind, and are able to learn how to navigate the world through this new modality. So this gave the scientists the idea that we might be able to detect other forces in the environment that we don't have, that we normally don't have access to. And actually spoke to a participant in a study where they gave people an experience of magnetic north, which is, of course, something that many other animals have that we don't have. So, there is a magnetic field to our Earth that some fish and birds and other animals have because it's useful for their survival. And we don't. But using that similar technology, scientists were able to convert the magnetic north and the Earth's magnetic field into an electrotactile signal that participants actually wore around their waist as a belt. And over the course of 6 weeks or so of training on this, they kind of developed this new sense of being able to feel the Earth's magnetic field. And so so here's one way in which experiencing new new forces, new light waves, new, all these things that we don't normally perceive, being able to experience them can actually give us intuitions for them. So, the reason we've been able to move forward to the degree we have with physics is not just because we use our minds and because we use these brilliant theories, but we have intuitions for the physics of the world because we perceive it. We perceive these forces. We can feel up and down. We can see things fall. And so a lot of our conscious experience is actually involved in the science to a degree that we forget because we take it for granted. And scientists are obviously able to communicate all of these ideas with each other because we all, we can all look out and say, yes, the table is here and it has this, surface to it and it has this color, and we can understand light waves because we see them and we've gained all these intuitions for them. And so the ability to feel things in the universe that we don't normally feel could actually help science progress because we'd have
But
an
that could just
yeah.
indicate brain plasticity. I mean,
Yes.
an
Oh,
implant, a
absolutely.
cochlear implant to the profoundly deaf may have
Yes.
only a
This is
thousand
not.
different things, but over 6 weeks they can learn to hear. I mean, it's an amazing
Yeah.
brain plasticity. So I'm not sure how that
Yeah,
would.
so this would not prove that consciousness is fundamental. This is just one of the ways in which thinking about consciousness being fundamental could
Expand
help
your
the
way of
science
thinking.
progress forward. So
Okay.
a better answer to your question is something else I've been thinking a lot about along these lines. I kind of wanted to bring in intuitions first, but to bring up Albert Einstein again and space-time. So he initially had an intuition for space-time. This was something that was internal to his thought process, but also to some sense of the way the universe works. And imagine, and Sarah Walker, who I know you've spoken with, writes beautifully in her book about the long process it took for between the time that Einstein had this intuition, had this really deeper understanding of reality, and the moment at which he was able to successfully communicate that to other scientists. And it's a decade long of him being able to transform what he knew internally into language that could be communicated to others. And so one thought I've had, and we don't have the technology for this, but it's not impossible to imagine. Imagine how much more quickly the science would have progressed if he could have shared that experience, the intuition, the conscious experience of what that insight entailed. So we are often very delayed in science by communication between, the language, whatever language we're using, in addition to the mathematics. It's if you compare it to being able to share intuitions, it's a very laborious process. And so I think that opens up room for science to progress, in addition to the fact that we can never obtain direct evidence of any conscious experience in the universe but our own, right? So in some sense, I'm just assuming that you're conscious. And the way I assume that is because in all of our similarities, I know that I'm having conscious experiences. You and I are similar enough, and we have all this language we can use to communicate. So you say that you see green and I see green, and I imagine that you're not just a computer over there, computing light waves and having no internal experience, but I can very easily imagine that there is a conscious experience of green arising over there in that place in the universe, in the same way that it's arising for me here. So the idea is that the more things we might be able to experience, the more intuitions we might have for other things that are conscious. And so I can only get some, it's not direct evidence, but I can get evidence that there are conscious experiences arising in space-time where you exist because of my intuitions and our ability to communicate. I have no ability to communicate if there's something it's like to be, the plant in the corner of the room. I have absolutely no way of assessing that. It's interesting also that in many cases with humans with brain damage, there's no way for us to assess whether they're conscious or not. And as we now know, in many cases they are. And so the question is it possible that other systems in nature that we have no ability to communicate with and that are very dissimilar from us, is it possible that there's some conscious experience arising there? And I think the ability for us to expand what we can process with our brains and therefore gain intuitions for, I definitely think that could lead us down the path toward having more confidence that systems that we originally thought didn't entail consciousness do entail consciousness, in the same way that, I have those intuitions for other people and cats and dogs, and we might be able to gain intuitions through some sort of experiential science for other systems that we normally can't communicate with.
Many thanks, Annaka. Lights On is an amazing revelatory auditory series. I recommend it to everyone. Viewers can watch over 1,500 Closer to Truth videos and over 100 Closer to Truth TV episodes on all facets of consciousness on the Closer to Truth website and YouTube channel. All facets, brain mechanisms, free will, personal identity, panpsychism, dualism, idealism, parapsychology, souls and spirits, life after death, cosmic consciousness, all infused with critical thinking. And we appreciate everyone's support. Tell your friends, like our videos, donate as you can. Thanks for watching. Thank you for watching. If you like this video, please like and comment below. You can support Closer to Truth by subscribing. Closer to Truth is now accepting your tax-exempt donations. Please come to closertotruth.com/donate. Thank you very much for supporting us, and thanks for watching.